This is Empowered Human Academy. Welcome home.
For me, I've never been a part of a situation where a greater degree of listening did not improve what was going on.
This is about love. This is about light. This is about the idea that you have everything you will ever need.
And this life of yours, this is where you grow, you expand, and you remember who you really are.
I'm Abe.
I'm Isaac.
In Empowered Human Academy, we join with humans of all kinds to feel the inspiration that can only come with empowered living.
The stories you hear today are unique, but the energy you hear today belongs to you too. So, with hearts wide open, let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Empowered Human Academy. Today we are chatting with our good friend Rich Holton. Rich, thanks so much for joining us today. We have spent a lot of time together in the last few years and we're so excited to dive into this conversation. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling super lucky to be here. I've spent a lot of quality time with you boys over the journey, and to add an hour on here, because we haven't caught up in a quick minute either. This is a good chance for me to just sort of have a genuine check-in with you both.
Cool. I'm here for that. Thank you. For those of you who don't know, actually, you know what? No, we'll talk about all that later. So let's begin, absent any discussion of or any labeling on my part of who Rich Holton is. We're going to talk about who you feel you are, and so our first question is that question of identity, not when you're presenting, not when you're trying to be anything in particular, but when it's just you being you. Who are you?
Oof. I try my best to be a listener. I work as an actor, and I try to apply whatever that means to, or should I say this? Acting was the thing that seemed to best harness whatever listening ability I had. And so it was the thing that I followed. Yeah. It's the thing that I've done over the past 6 years here in Chicago, primarily on stage, but I've worked on camera on Chicago PD, done commercials for products like Jim Beam, worked with other companies on camera like The Onion, but primarily done the stage stuff that's available here in Chicago by the great storefront theater scene, the bigger equity houses that we have, and Steppenwolf and Goodman, and the improv stuff, Second City, IO. And it's been weird having all that be gone the past year. So I would actually say I don't really know who I am, but I'm figuring it out every day.
Yeah. Let's begin with the listener thing, and actually let's bring that next to the identity as actor, because as somebody who's not in the profession, the connection there isn't immediately obvious to me. Like from somebody who's a spectator off stage in the audience watching you do your thing, it seems like it could be the opposite of listening, right? Like I see you projecting as an actor, in the arts. Connect for me, if you will, the way that you see this. How is listening connected with acting?
Absolutely. It's a really interesting opposite dynamic to point out, because when I talk about listening in terms of inspiring one to be an actor, really get into any kind of an art, I think it's got to come from a listening to the world around you. That probably starts when you're a young kid. I think that there's something to be said for a lot of creative people, maybe, being more shy. Maybe that's a trope. I think there's a lot of extroverts that, luckily can get into performance early on as well. But, for me, storytelling has just, been about how do I make sense of what's going on around me and, the world we live in. And, hopefully if I'm doing that with integrity, it involves a lot of listening in my day-to-day life. Yeah. And, a lot of decentering myself and, just trying to be in touch with the heartbeat of what's going on with the pockets that I'm exposed to.
Sure. That makes sense. Why is that important to you?
Because honestly, one thing that I've always brought back to you, and my favorite thing you ever said to me, was when one time we were at the gym and I had made some shitty comment about something that other people do, people who do this, da da da. And of course, like forever sage, patient, like Isaac is like, I think we're all the same person. And that was always something that it just stuck with me. And as that relates to the listening, it's, you know, hopefully learning more about who I am by listening to other people. I mean, especially existing in somewhat of a space now where I don't necessarily feel like I know who I am because just of like any industry that's been affected by public assembly. Obviously the arts and entertainment, even more so if you're someone in the live performance sector of that, has, you know, been without their craft really for the past year. And I've been so inspired by how much heart and gusto I have seen from people in keeping the creative spirit alive over this time. You know, not just with whatever people do on social media, but, you know, the way theaters are doing digital performances. I'm going to do a play reading with a great Chicago company called Timeline Theater on April 11th.
Cool.
And, you know, it's great to see that it's coming back in like small ways as well, you know, with everybody getting vaccinated and, you know, there's optimism.
Totally. So kind of going forward with the theme of, my next question with the theme of storytelling and listening and how they're kind of connected. What have you learned about yourself? You might be in a stage right now that you are kind of just exploring what that means to feel like yourself. But what do you know, or what do you feel like in this past year has been really resonant with you in terms of maybe you've had time to listen to your likes or dislikes, or, you know, what you want to happen next? Like, what has been a kind of like grounding force for you internally in this last year as you've been listening to yourself, if that's even, you might not have been listening to yourself in the last year, which is fine. But I'm curious if there is anything that has come up in the last year as a product of listening.
Oh man. Yeah, totally. I mean, I hope that like wherever any of us are, it's like, if you look back to where you were a year ago from that day, you're like, man, how different things are, you know, even in a time now where maybe a lot of people's material realities look the same because we've all been sort of, you know, in one place for this amount of time. And, you know, especially during a time of like sort of existential angst and like, you know, being unsure of like where one's life is going. I think it's just good to like fall back to the things that like, you know, to be true. And for me, you know, I've never been a part of a situation where a greater degree of listening did not improve what was going on. And so that's why it's been one of my guiding principles, like over this time. And I mean, you know, things that have come to me of just the value of time. You know, I can't believe it's a year back already that, you know, all of this started going down. And I think that like, you know, if there was one thing that I actually enjoyed maybe on the front end of this in a maybe masochistic weird way was, you know, especially when everything was so locked down as it had to be for the, you know, health considerations. It was like the first time that there were no moves to make. There were no Joneses to keep up with. There was no like game to get left behind on. There was no societal scorecard because like nobody could really do anything. And that made me call into question just so many things, like of just, you know, habits and like practices and schedules and routines that you fall into out of just that, you know, habit and routine. And what are the ways these help me and the ways that these don't?
What did you learn on balance, like inspecting that palette of habit that you had in front of you?
Honestly, the amount more that I was sedentary this year in my life really blew my mind open to like things I already thought I knew in terms of the importance of movement, the importance of mobility, and just like having a restorative relationship with your body. Because I've always been a busybody, you know what I mean? I've always worked in the theater. I've always, or at least, for my first 5 years here in Chicago, I worked as a trainer.
Yeah.
And, a lot of that was just me running around all day, and a lot of, body awareness and like body work just built into my lifestyle. And so like so many other people have, built that into their routines. When this happened, it was a real physical shift, and in a way that just makes you appreciate it, like you do not know what you got until it's gone type of situation.
Totally.
Yeah.
And just telling people you love them. I mean, that's like, it's an easy thing to say, but just because it's the most true thing to say.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure other people, like I lost people over the course of this year. People that I didn't necessarily get to say goodbye to the way that I would have wanted to.
Yeah.
And, that feeling is so much more intolerable than like whatever the 5 minutes of like moderate discomfort it takes to work through the end of a long random Tuesday that I've been working. And I know I should like call my mom, but fuck, like I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah.
I've seen you, I guess, so a lot of our relationship comes from, the gym, right? And physical movement.
Totally.
And I've seen you, like in the odd moments where we walk in on you finishing a workout, or we're leaving the gym and you're beginning one, right? Like I've gotten glimpses of seeing Rich, like by himself, ostensibly doing the workout thing. And I see you working so hard every time.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to know more about that, because it feels, at least to me anyway, that's where my mind jumped when I heard you say like the little bit of discomfort right now is better than, the alternative that I could run into. So I guess actually I'm curious, I kind of want to truncate the question right there and ask you about, and let you talk about like, what is your relationship to like the physical duress that you put yourself into when it's just you and a rack?
Oh, totally. Well, training has always been a part of my life in some degree. I guess it just started with like playing sports as a kid. I played all of them growing up. Got serious about football and baseball in high school. Ended up playing baseball in college for a couple of years, semi-professionally in Holland in 2012.
Cool.
And my coaching career actually started working for Little League International in 2012. I took a year off of college, as you guys know, to go abroad and play in Europe, but also spend time in Uganda and work with different school systems in Kampala and Jinja, and over the umbrella of Little League International. And that was the last time that sports was actually the guiding principle in my working out. Since then, it's truly been about the strength and conditioning aspect of it. And I think, like a lot of people, it starts off egotistically. You want to look a certain way, you want to feel a certain way.
Totally. Same.
I was always a chubby kid growing up. It really wasn't until I was like 17, 18 that I sort of shed a softer body, as it were.
Yeah.
And, strength and conditioning has just always been a tool of self-development for me to learn more about myself, and a lot of times, like, through that listening that I was talking about earlier, like what are the emotions that I feel when I put myself in a contained state of stress? Because I think that is important, a contained state of stress. And, there's a different, like, I really once heard a distinction between working out and training from Mark Ripito, who's a famous barbell coach that I appreciated. which was working out, is, you know, something that's done. I may be butchering this, by the way, but working out is something that's done for the experiential aspect today versus training, which is something that is, you know, intentionally executed today as a part of a larger plan to achieve X result. And here's the thing that I'll add to that is I think both are valid. It's entirely about like what you want to get out of it. And at different points in my life, both of those concepts have been useful to me. Like where sometimes like I'm just fucked up mentally and like my anxiety is fucking, you know, bad. I got like a shitty relationship with eating at the moment. And it's really just good for me to make, you know, my relationship with training not about receiving some predefined external reward, like a one rep max and a new lift, and more about like, what if I just made the goal of this effort expenditure and like choosing breath and bravery in moments where I feel scared and small, and moment to moment really focusing on that rather than the numbers, which are super important. You know, like a lot of people end up spinning their wheels for years because they don't understand proper training metrics of progressive overload, you know, and introducing the right stimulus to get what they want. But to me, a lot of it also has to do with different people I've gotten to know in my life who have had their physical ability taken from them in like a variety of means. Like my dad is somebody, my parents are older, like they're in their 70s now. They had me like mid 40s ish, whatever. Yeah. And I hear all these stories about how he used to be a really strong dude. And just by virtue of his age and like, you know, other self-care things that he did not do in terms of like, you know, substances or whatever, and taking care of oneself in terms of older human strength training and working out. I never knew that, you know, and that always made me realize that like, this is finite, and not like in a scary way, but like in a self-defined way. Like this is going to be a good situation, you know, me and my body and moving for as long as I determine it to be. Yeah. And, you know, the goals will, you know, come from that, you know, the abs, the fucking pounds on the bar, the whatever, but that's got to be the guiding force. And, my really good friend, Chris Norton, who actually just had I'm going to plug the shit out of it right now.
Please do it.
Because this is my day one. My boy, Chris Norton, his documentary 7 Yards. It's on Amazon Prime. I'm in like a split second of it, but long story short, he's a guy I lived next to my freshman year of college, like in the dorms. And he got paralyzed from the neck down when we were 18 in a football game. Our freshman year of college, and I was playing baseball, but I lived next door to him. And, you know, we got close just through the proximity of all that. And I ended up living with him a few years out of college with a group of other guys who played football and had known him for over the years. And we were all trained as like, you know, super basic, like live-in care nurses in like a sort of 10-pod living situation. And it was one of the most valuable experiences of my life because, you know, he works as a public speaker now. He's, you know, doing all types of things with philanthropy and securing money for people who are uninsured to get like rehabilitative treatment in the wake of their injury that they need through the SciCan Foundation. And, you know, this was not somebody that I saw in a post. This was not somebody that I saw in a movie. Like this was a dude who I used to pass in the shower. You know, who's an animal at strong safety. And now we're working on brushing his teeth. And it made me appreciate just how much of a gift every day to have full autonomy over your instrument is. And I mean, to his credit, like that's just one of the many things that he taught me through that. Like sometimes people ask me if I ever felt sorry for him, and it's like, frankly, fucking not, dude, but not because of like anything to do with me, but just because I never saw him feel sorry for himself.
Yeah.
I only ever saw him grow as a person and be better for, every moment that came before.
Yeah.
And yeah, please.
Which makes me wonder, like in your capacity, as a coach or somebody working alongside people who have that relationship themselves, or in your capacity, as actor, listening to the people that you are, like listening to the stories and listening to people who are hearing them, all the ways that those directions play in. What is your relationship to, how do I say this? Okay, here's the first way I want to say this, and I may amend my question. What is your relationship
I'm with you, baby.
to other people's relationships to themselves?
Oh, man. That's a great question. I hope it's really sensitive and like respectful. Okay. And I definitely, I want people to see the best in themselves.
Yeah.
The same way that I want to see the best in me.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole idea that everything's always its opposite.
I've heard you say that before.
It's like, if you're going to if you're trying to find the best in yourself, look for the best in other people.
And
yeah, I mean, just, I guess to go back to like what you had asked in the previous question about like, what is like, training and whatnot for me is, it's an act of gratitude each time out. That's like the unifying theme that has been prevalent in all that I've done in movement.
Sure.
Hopefully, if I'm doing it right.
I want to touch on the moment in your training that you were talking about, how like it's this practice of being calm in the midst of this chaos and practicing.
Totally.
How have you gotten good at it? Because, a lot of folks, especially, I think of my relationship for the first 2 years of working out. It's a really vulnerable space. And a lot of people just say, F this, I'm over it and I'm out of it. Why would I put myself through it? What's your relationship to that space, and how have you gotten comfortable? And if you have any like tips on how to get comfortable with it, I'd love to hear.
Totally. Well, one of the most damning things is that the most potent medicine for consistency and complicity and, following through on a training program or whatever is seeing results. And unfortunately, that takes some amount of time. That first year, the first 3 to 6 months, whatever your initial foray is in from whatever space you're in, is just so tough because you have to run on blind faith. It's easy to like be into it when you've been doing it for a long time and have been doing it well and like consistently see results. And that's not to take away, anything from anybody. Like you earn that shit, enjoy it, have fun, be a beacon of light for everybody else trying to figure out what's going on. But that's why I do love, like when I was I ran the kids program at CrossFit Sono here in Chicago for like 4 years. And, but just because by definition, they're just at the beginning, I always, I enjoy working with people at the beginning of their journey in terms of like training.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, honestly, like one aspect of it is scope of practice in terms of, I think that like when you're a trainer, because it's such an oversaturated market and it's so unregulated, working with people that you can legitimately help and that like you're set up to help and that like you can do business with integrity. And I don't think at all, obviously, that like whatever you do as an athlete is a correlation to what your coaching skill is going to be.
Oh, sure.
But I think that there's also like a sliding scale in here that has to be adhered to. Like,
that makes sense.
if you want to squat 500 pounds, like, find somebody who has squatted 500 pounds.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
If you want to bench 2 plates, squat 3, get to a 4-plate deadlift and do it while trying to get to 10% body fat and work a 9-to-5 job and like be a regular dude, come holler at your boy, because that was, what I felt like I had done that was a worthwhile product, in terms of like the economic arrangement of it.
Yep. That makes sense. Yeah.
Going back to your getting used to being in the moment. So you are
Totally.
Being in the thick of it. So it's just a matter of showing up and getting used to it then.
I think that seeing results is the, best thing to keep you going. I think that having a strong why, is the foundation of seeing through anything that's going to be difficult. Because one thing that I think is true in terms of like training and moments of stress and whatnot, and I've learned this a lot through what I've done in martial arts as a competitive like kickboxer and like super, low level jiu-jitsu person. But it's a fallacy to think that we rise to the occasion a lot of the times. Like that is a very romantic idea that exists in a lot of stories, which I know as an actor. And that's why stories exist a lot of the time is it's vicarious living. It's getting to listen and have empathy through the lens of somebody else's perspective through a certain kind of journey.
Yeah.
And we don't rise to the occasion. We fall to the level of our training.
Go on.
So when you meet that moment of chaos and like, you're not the knight in shining armor that you thought you should have been when you were thinking about this workout on the drive into the gym.
Yeah.
Don't immediately take yourself out of the running right there because you didn't meet a false expectation for what this moment was going to be. If you're dancing on that knife's edge, you're doing the thing, you know what I mean? You're doing what you're there to be doing, which is exposed. Yeah, please, AB.
Go ahead, go finish, which is exposing
the most adaptive instrument you'll ever own to the stimulus that's going to beget some change. And I hope that's the thing that if any beginners that like I've ever worked with or people that have learned anything from me in terms of movement have learned, it's just that like your body is the most beautiful adaptive instrument you will ever own. It will do exactly what you tell it to do. And that conversation is just has such potential. You know what I mean? I hope you have it.
I love that. I think of the movement moving forward and the training that you're talking about. And I feel like not just in the gym, but with acting, how to get up from maybe a no, a time that you said someone has said no to you in terms of an audition,
Totally.
Or the moments where you're like, fuck, what do I do now? Like the more times you do it, AKA the more you train yourself to get back up. Same thing with mindset stuff with my clients. Some of my clients in the beginning, they're like, man, I'm frustrated. I've had a, not so good of a week. I'm like, it's okay. Expect yourself to, because we started 2 months ago. Like if you've been living for 30 years and then you can't expect to be like all happy and joyful all the time if for the majority of your life you haven't been. So I love the idea of training and kind of getting back up, falling, and getting kind of the stimulus that the stimulation and the kind of internal feeling that you're feeling, have it be like a really known thing to navigate and to do something with.
Totally.
Like you're talking about. I think that's so powerful.
And that's exactly what it is like, hopefully in its best form is like, yo, this is a safe space to engage with chaos. And, what is a safe space? Hopefully it's one that you don't get hurt. Everybody's risk assessment is their own.
Totally.
And again, it should be a vehicle of self-development insofar as showing you in this controlled environment, hey, there is value on the other side of intentionally feeling uncomfortable and like putting yourself through a vulnerability process, especially with other people. You know, whether you're, you know, and see that in your relationships and your job, whatever.
This kind of ties to, when I think of you, I think of the word resilient, because like you said before the pandemic, you are always on the go. You're at the gym at 5 a.m.
Totally.
leading classes, then you're leading us, then you have 3 auditions and you're back at night. Like you were, when I think of you and your success, whether it be in the gym or, you know, acting or in your career, I'm like, I am not going to be surprised when you get everything you want, because you keep on showing up amidst every obstacle that has come your way. And have you always been that resilient? Like, what is your relationship to your own resilience?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that. Jeez, I'm working on it every day. And I mean, hopefully, I've set up a life that I don't want to say doesn't need a lot of, or doesn't have a lot of resilience, but for the layout that you just said, I'm doing a lot of things I love. You know what I mean? I love teaching. I love getting up and training early. Like, I love performing. I love riding my bike through the city of Chicago. You know, I got rid of my car years ago because like my commutes on my like bicycle in the city are sometimes the most creative part of my day in a lot of ways. And it's easy to, you know, it's easy to show up and work hard when you just genuinely enjoy everything that you're doing.
That's real.
I was thinking about that when you were talking about the safe environment. Like, I think there's a difference between failing miserably majority of the time in a safe environment versus failing miserably all the time in an unsafe environment. Like, the reason why we worked out for 5 days a week for 2 years together with you is because we felt safe, right? If I didn't feel comfortable and safe around you, I would find another trainer, right? So I think that's like a really important thing that I've learned in my journey, and even like just just by working out with you for 2 years and working out with a team of people in the last 4 years, is that like, you don't have to put yourself through an extra layer of misery. Like, you know, falling and getting back up, and like, that's going to be hard. Some days you probably woke up at 4 a.m. and you're like, fuck, I don't want to do this. I'm tired. I would rather go back to bed. But you know that you're, again, going to something that you enjoy and doing something that you enjoy in an environment that you enjoy. I feel like that's totally different than waking up, going to or talking in a relationship, or being in a relationship that you hate, or being at a job that you hate, or all these different things, which there's a level of privilege there. I understand that, but like, don't opt into an added level of complexity if you don't need to. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally.
I don't know if that resonates with you. That's just a random thought. Isaac?
I'll second. You've done our own personal anecdote. You did a remarkable job of creating a space where we felt safe, and I think it was because, in large part, because you are like listening to something that you do well. Which brings me to this question, which is how, or have you consciously worked on improving listening? Like, if we plot Rich's ability as a listener on a 2D graph, which is probably a gross oversimplification, but if we were to just do that, what's your listening been like over time? Have you worked on it? Have you not?
Totally. One of the biggest seminal moments in my listening was when I heard the expression, "Good is good if it's good for me." And it was one of the things that I just heard immediately and was like, what? And it's the idea that, you know, not that there's no overarching, you know, universal moral good, but just that there's maybe a human egocentric inclination to define whatever is the good thing for everybody as the good thing for you. And a lot of times it's unconscious. And this is the key to like entertaining with this kind of thinking without getting pessimistic, which is like just not helpful for anybody.
Yeah.
Is that it's not based in like shittiness.
Sure.
It's just based in what we're all dealing with 24/7, which is I have my perspective, mine alone, and I give it a way outsized focus of attention.
Yeah.
And, you know, how that's related to my listening is whenever I hear ideas that make me feel a certain type of way, I hear something I disagree with, I try to consider what is my self-interest in this, what is my bias in this, what is the good is good that's good for me going on in my head right now that may be getting in the way of my seeing the truth.
Sure.
In terms of business, it's like, just like an easy way to explain it is like, well, of course, everybody thinks like the way that they get paid more money of an equation is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
You're getting more money, but it's like, where is the righteousness behind that? And that's not to say that those two things can't line up.
Sure.
This is just my, again, how I'm going through these things as they come up.
Yeah, that makes sense. You said halfway through that thought, like without taking this the pessimistic route and without like being shitty about it. Talk to me about your sense of optimism with all this, because it's a popular perspective. Like the negative side of that is a popular perspective. Like everyone's either consciously in it for themselves or everyone's stuck in their own worldview and can't see over to their neighbors. What's the optimistic take on good is good if it's good for me?
If you recognize it, you can think around it.
Okay.
And that humans have agency. We have, thought agency. We actually do have a choice in how we respond to something. Yeah. And that is not to say that your initial reactions, especially if they're of like an emotionally gripping, sort.
Sure.
Are invalid or not an important part of that process. But again, I'm not any kind of a therapist or whatever, but I think, all cognitive behavioral therapy that I've ever, been a part of that's, been helpful has been some form of, what is the story that I'm telling myself?
Okay.
And, me saying good is good if it's good for me, and that being maybe like something that humans deal with on a mass level that gets in the way of truth, that may be something I observe, but the story I tell myself about why that is and how it happens is super important. And it's just that, dude, it's a scary world. People are scared. It's fucking terrifying to be human.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to succumb to a scarcity mentality. And, I think you do have to make, maybe at some point in your life, like a philosophical decision about, do I believe there's enough in the world for everyone?
Yeah.
Because if you don't believe that, well, then, it just follows to make sense that, you're going to be suspicious and distrustful of other people and like their motives and inherent nature. And, if you, think that there is enough for everybody, is it going to be more likely for you to be taken advantage of? Yeah. Everything is always its opposite.
Sure.
And you've got to be able to toe that fine line. But that's what puts me in the space that makes me excited to live every day.
Yeah.
My mom always used to tell me, it's some Einstein quote, but in her old Southern way, she would say, baby, the most important decision you can make every day is that the universe is a benevolent place. And I was like, you're right, mama. You're right. Because it sets a tone for everything else. And I don't want to be mad at people for being scared.
Totally.
I want to be strong and loving.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. I feel that really deeply. 2 seconds ago, you said like the world is a scary place, semicolon, people are scared. And for me, the emotional payload in those two statements couldn't be more different, recognizing this is my perspective on what you were saying. But what I felt there was a juxtaposition between like a value judgment on the world and like the what for me would be a hopelessness if I looked at the world as a place of like ultimate scarcity and tragedy versus the way that I do see it, which is, you know, the universe is benevolent. But the difference between like taking a look at that or trying on that perspective for a second and then suspending that and instead turning our attention to the idea that people are just scared. And that for me inspires hope, I suppose, maybe empathy first, but the notion that like we are all just humans and everyone is at a different place in their very human experience. Maybe it's going back to like you recalled the idea like we're all the same person, which if the internet is listening, I got from Tumblr. I don't know where that came from originally, but anyway, the idea that we're all the same person, if we look around and just see like, and just observe people are scared, that gives me something to connect to and something that I can work with because I know what it feels like to be scared. And I know that I can connect with people if that's what I'm looking at. Not like the world is a scary place, but like people are scared. Like the latter thing is something that I know that I can work with.
I was thinking about what you were saying in your training, how like the chaos and getting used to that to train you for more calm or more strength in other parts of your life, basically. I'm trying to connect, my brain's trying to connect, like if people are scared and we haven't created systems where people feel safe, then like that's an invitation to do that, right? If I'm scared to work out, you're going to provide a safe space for me because I'm scared, because you've been through your own type of scared in your own journey. And then you're able to pass it on to me. I don't know. I think it's an invitation. Like it's an invitation to, of course, start with empathy and be like, okay, this is where you're coming from. And also like, what are we going to create from this? Are we going to create more scarcity spaces? Are we going to create more spaces of scarcity? Sure. Or are we going to create spaces of abundance and safety and love? I don't know. It sounds really cheesy, but I don't know. I've seen it lived out in the way in our relationship. I mean, like,
yeah, totally.
We spent a lot of time in together in 2 years, and I mean, I've seen it a lot of other places too. But I'm just curious about that perspective.
I think a lot of it, it starts with people admitting that they're coming from a place of fear, which is like really hard.
Weirdly, yeah.
And a lot of it comes back, with what we're saying about how we're all the same person is just another semantic iteration of like, do unto others as you would do to yourself, treat people the way you want to be treated.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do I want to be engaged with, when I'm scared?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if people can't accept the fact that they're scared, how can I accept that you're scared? It's just a broken response system if we're starting from that perspective.
Totally. And I mean, I think one of the things that like really galvanized my change in thought around like the idea of fear and like embracing it was actually some words from a great jiu-jitsu artist, Royce Gracie, in a documentary, an old martial arts documentary called Choke. It's worth watching to everybody, but this is a guy who is one of the greatest martial artists in the world, one of the first people to make mixed martial arts something popular that people were interested in back in the 80s. But he says that, fear and intelligence are very close together in the mind. And, what I took from that was that what he was talking about was these things are both about threat perception.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot to be said about like human brain wiring for a world that just does not apply in a modern context. I remember once reading about like ADD being something that like, we talk about it however we do now, but like maybe at one time in human history, it was a very beneficial set of like, certain kind of brain patterns to have to like do well in like how human life was.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me, I mean, it's like you have someone who's like one of the baddest motherfuckers on the planet telling you he's scared, that he's scared of everything. And that's why like heroes are people who are honest, and heroes are people who embody both sides of an ideal, because it takes, both sides of that equation to really, mirror the other to its highest form. And, you know, Jesus, I saw that, you know, when I was a kid, but it was the first time I had seen, especially like a traditionally masculine, you know, fighting man talk about being afraid in a way that wasn't just okay. It was like, you were strong for recognizing that.
Yeah.
You know, like, dude, there's nothing wrong with you. There's actually everything right with you. Like, you're not a dum-dum. And as that translates to people who are, you know, starting their workout journey, it's like, dude, you're not scared because you're weak or because, you know, you're broken. You're scared because you're pretty smart in recognizing that this is going to be a massive undertaking to get what a lot of people want out of it, and what a lifetime of conscious movement practice will give you, whether it's yoga, whether it's strength training, whether it's jujitsu, whether it's bar method, whether it's anything under the sun, you know, hopefully all towards the end of, you know, your own benefit. But you trust me, like, if you're afraid going into it's a tough conversation to have, you know, because it's like, what's the difference between, you know, fear that is letting me know I'm walking down the right path and fear that's telling me to get out and get away from whatever's going on.
Ooh, interesting.
How do you tell?
And I mean, hopefully that's where like good coaches come into play, you know, and like what people who are, you know, seeking external help in the form of like, you know, group class, just any kind of training, you know, those are the circumstances that they set up, which is in that intentional exposure to like stress stimulus and, you know, chaos. How are we doing this in a way that like everybody is safe? Everybody still has their bodily autonomy. You know, because I think that's the big thing.
I think about that outside of the gym, the friends that you're hanging out with, the work situation that you're at, the relationship that you're participating in. It's like, it's all the same to me, but that's like that. I've never heard that thought, like being scared of survival or being scared that it just might be new, or like the differences in fear.
I wonder if we can tie this to like the original concept of listening that we've been talking about. Because there's like, I can hear a thing and then I run it through the lens of my perception, right? And there are a bunch of different ways that my interpretation could go. An easy way to split that down the middle is, you know, related to what you just said. Like, is the fear that I'm hearing in myself, is that something that's going to be useful or something that's going to prematurely get me out of the game, you know, in a way that's counterproductive? So
totally.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? Like, how do you?
No, I mean, I
go ahead.
I think that's a great distinction. And I was thinking the same thing as you were saying it, which is I've never put it in those terms either, actually. But like, now that I think about it, a great deal of my life is spent being afraid and trying to like suss through which fears are ones I want to follow and which ones are ones that are telling me to like get the fuck out of here. You know, what are the fears that are me challenging my preconceived notions about myself? What are my fears about, you know, breaking my habits and routines to do something ultimately better? You know, because I think one of the saddest things that we're all set up for, being human beings, is that like we will stay in suboptimal circumstances and environments if they're familiar. You know, just based off like, you know, the routine of it. Or what are the, you know, fears that are me being like, hey, this is a relationship that, you know, is toxic. This is a job that is, you know, wasting my time or like undervaluing me or whatever. And
so it's using your listening skills to befriend your fears and to really like understand them more, right? Would you? Totally.
You know, first just like destigmatizing that idea that like, you know, you're not going to be afraid, and like sort of retooling however that needs to exist in your mind to be like galvanizing and actionable and positive and pragmatic.
That's really
please.
That's really encouraging for me, because I've been scared a lot. And I used to be, you know, ashamed of being scared, especially married to someone who has a lot less fear than I do in some areas. But I've been able to be like you've been talking about listening, is this fear trying to protect me from dying, or is this fear going to help me get better at something or get me out of my norm or get me out of my routine? But I just feel really like, I don't know, heard and seen after you saying that, because I mean, having a relationship with fear, because when you think of fear, you're like, well, I don't want to be scared, but actually it's the human condition to be scared. Like it's a human, like it's normal to be scared of some things, but to not let that, again, not let that paralyze you into a place where you are stuck, if that makes sense.
What I think we're getting at here is, and what I hear when you say like, it's the human condition, to be like, to experience fear. I think that's absolutely right. And it's like to the end point that fear is something designed to keep you alive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, if we go back to like, how does our brain work now versus like, how has it operated and been practically applied for like most of the time humans have been on the planet?
Yeah.
Is that, you experience fear as a safeguard, against things that are potentially hazardous.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And, I think that it's in the vein of what we've, always said in terms of everything's always its opposite, that, you will live your life fullest sort of having a healthy dance with the thing that is safeguarding your life from hazard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not letting that overtake your life. You know what I'm saying?
That's why, that's why it's a dance. That's why it's a balancing act. And like, that's why like balance is honestly like the only answer I've heard to a question that's like right all the time.
We're both like, yeah, no. Do you feel kind of connecting this to your journey as an actor and the fear and the balance and the dance? Like, is that related? Is the way you approach your own fear and consistently showing up, is that connected to your resilience through like just gunning after what you want? Have you been?
Oh, I mean, like the whole reason I became an actor was like, because it was so scary to me. Like I wasn't somebody who was a child performer. I was super, super shy as a kid. And like I said, I played a lot of sports because I think that was a safe space for me, and a way for me to have a community. Again, like I'm an only child. My parents split up when I was young. I spent a lot of time, alone, going from house to house. Being on sports teams as a kid was a way for, hours every day to like be around a big group of other people and like run around and, play dress up and get emotionally invested and be loud and care.
Yeah.
And, it takes a certain amount of deconditioning to realize, well, I can do all that and not chase this stupid ass ball around. That sounds lovely. I kid, but not really, those are the things like that appealed to me about performance coming from an athletic background. And I was afraid, honestly, to like get called on to reading class, even in like fucking college, dude.
Wow.
And, whatever ends up happening in terms of like theater and live performance, especially on the other side of this pandemic, like just to have gotten to get up at like these great institutions of Chicago and like Second City and IO and, the Annoyance, and like tear down rooms doing improv comedy, several nights a week for the past, like, 5 fucking years or whatever. It's like, if that's my point B from like being a chubby kid who's afraid to read in class, then like this journey has been worth something,
Fuck yeah, dude. Yeah.
I really love also how you shared an Einstein quote and a jiu-jitsu quote. That just kind of like,
oh hell yeah,
paints a beautiful picture of you, like a
check
baseball player, actor.
After this episode.
What was that?
I said check the appendix after this episode.
I love it. I love that. I love the diversity of thought today. We are unfortunately approaching time. We could.
That was so fast.
I know. It was so fast. Okay, so we have 2 questions that we usually ask.
Please hit
but
me.
First, if first, before we ask these two questions, is there anything that comes to mind right now that you're feeling that you just want to share? Like, what does it feel like to talk about these things?
I said at the beginning of this that I felt like I didn't know who I was, and just sort of a general comment on like, you know, whatever the identity shift over the last year has been. Yeah. But I feel like I know more about who I am now. And all that's happened is like talking to people I like, love, and care about, you know, about things that are interesting to me. And so kind of tethering back to what I'd said earlier about like, yo, like call people, you know, tell them you love them.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to find, if you're somebody who also doesn't feel like you know who you are right now, like just talk to the people you love about things you care about, and like be as open as you can, and you're going to find out more. And like, this hour was just a small, like, proof positive window of that for me. And like, thank you for that on this random Sunday.
Yeah. Wow.
I didn't know I needed that, and, or, you know, that I was going to get it.
That's really cool. That's really dope.
That's a sign of, I don't know, something good for me. Like if this, I mean, on a shit ton of levels, right? But like if the structures that we set up for ourselves surprise us in positive ways, that's a good sign. And
totally.
That I've seen that in the history that I've been lucky enough to see and take part in for a little bit. And I'm delighted that happened here. Thank you for sharing that. That's fucking great. I love you.
No, guys, thank you so much for having me on. I mean, like, what else? Is there any other questions?
Yeah, totally. We've got two.
Please.
questions.
Yeah, no, hit me. Hit me.
Here we are. I was just waxing affectionate there, I guess, for a second, which I will not apologize for. Question.
Waxing back at you, boy. What's
fantastic? Wax on, wax off. Anyway, so the penultimate question is: what does an empowered Rich Holton feel like?
An empowered Rich Holton feels like he has listened and he has heard accurately and deeply. And inevitably, I can't be that without other people constantly sharing their truth and affirming to me that I am indeed, you know, hearing them on that level.
That's awesome. Final question. What do you know for sure?
When in doubt, balance. And, you know, we've said a few times, everything's always its opposite. And I've actually had an addendum to that idea and you know, it's something I've always said and held on to, but like, you know, every idea, I hope that like everything's open to be reinformed by like new information that comes up.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the idea that everything encompasses all things.
Ooh.
And it's a semantic difference that's small, but the key in it is there were times when I would say to I'd recognize that everything was always its opposite. And sometimes it would make me prejudiced to start immediately searching for the flip side of something, thinking that I could like shortcut, like, you know, the journey of truth seeking. Whereas everything encompasses all things is a recognition of that same idea, you know, that like everything can just as easily be its opposite.
Yeah.
But it's slightly less inclining and leading towards a space of, as I say, prejudice and judgment.
Yeah.
And so I would say to people, like, everything encompasses all things, you know, your fears included, as we talked about earlier. And like, all you can do is find that balance between what's useful, what's not, and, you know, live the best you can every day.
It's a very powerful note to end on. I'm very happy that you said that and that you're here with us.
Hell yeah, boys.
Thank you. We are forever fortunate to be able to have spent 2 years where we worked out with you 5 days a week. That's a lot.
Totally.
Of time together.
I mean,
hours.
And I mean, you guys went to so many shows that whole time. I mean, you saw like the beginning years of my acting journey in a way, dude. And like, We need. We'll do a phone call after this. We'll catch up another way. But I love you boys. I so appreciate y'all having me on.
Thank you, man.
Thanks, Rich.
Talk soon.
Over and out.
All right, talk soon, boys.
Bye.
Bye now.
This podcast is the work of Lightward, our company, named for that toward the light direction which informs every single thing that we do, including money, which means, like everything else, the way we earn revenue is not based on industry norms. It's based on what feels deeply right and aligned by passing through the door that feels like it has more behind it, not less. And the way we keep this podcast going is all Lightward. It's pay what feels good. It's an exchange of value between you and us. We're keeping conventional podcast advertising totally out of this. And here's how Pay What Feels Good works. We give you this episode because it feels good to do so. And you consider, honestly, what number of dollars this episode is genuinely worth to you. I do not care if that's $3, $1,000, or literally $0 and a heart emoji, as long as that trade genuinely makes your day better. And the energy there is the entire point. That is what we're building our business on. No advertisers, no selling your attention, just you and us, trading value in a way that builds us both up. So whatever the number, when you're done listening, head to empoweredhumanacademy.com and hit the Pay What Feels Good button. We use this policy across all of our company's work, and I'm really excited to bring it here to the world of podcasts. This is us voting for the world we want to see. Thank you for being here.